The race is on, and with great tyre management, one of the keys to McLaren's pace advantage, what exactly is it doing to keep the rear Pirellis under control? Plus, could Carlos Sainz Sr. really be FIA president? I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to hit those topics and more are Ben Anderson and John Noble. John, we'll come to you first. I think you've got to put a disclaimer in before you start talking. A disclaimer you can probably blame me for the need for.
Yeah, it's the F1 lurgy. Generally, I think normally like 3-4 times a year, everybody in the F1 paddock gets ill. I think mixture of either air conditioning, heat, hotel rooms, airplanes. So I survived the first 4 races I did fine. Quite shocked, actually, because normally China knocks me over or one of the Middle Eastern, but came through fine. Miami got me down. So a bit apologies for the croakiness and coughs and sniffles, but I shall battle through.
I shouldn't have forced you to go by not having my visa in time. And Ben Anderson, are you 100% fit and ready to go?
Yes, I am. Fortunately, no F1 lurgy for me. I remember my worst experience of F1 lurgy. I think it was 2016 or 17 going to the Russian Grand Prix. I got an absolutely terrible dose of it and passed it on to Jenson Button because I had an Autosport interview with him. And apparently he told McLaren he had the worst cold he'd ever had.
Excellent. Yeah, you've always got to watch out for infecting drivers with things. I don't really appreciate that sort of thing, but obviously...
apologies to Jenson.
Well, McLaren wasn't that competitive at that point. I suppose 16 was the better of the Honda years, but still not much good. So probably not such bad timing. But anyway, plenty for us to talk about today. And obviously, John, the McLaren rear tyre temperature management has been a huge talking point, subject of some behind-the-scenes insinuations in places as well. So what can you tell us about this inspection that the FIA did after Miami?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's been a big focus from other teams about what McLaren is doing. The simple answer is nobody knows apart from McLaren, obviously. And obviously, when teams don't know what another team's doing, the instant assumption from some is that, it must be a grey area of the regulations or they're cheating or something. So there's been various theories thrown around about liquid cooling, which is nonsense, kind of carbon fibre drums that are degrading to let cool air through, which isn't allowed. I think the ultimate gist of it is that basically it's very, very, very good engineering. You and I spoke to Gary Anderson yesterday, who's run us through this. We're preparing a little piece on this. I think it's one of those classic things in Formula One where it's a culmination of many, many good engineering decisions that all contribute 1% of performance, and then everything adds up to make it brilliant. So they are basically managed to run their rear brakes drums cooler than anybody else. It helps the tyres, it helps the tyre management. The tyres don't slide, the tyres don't overheat, and you get this good virtuous circle of what's happening. But the accusations have been floating around. There's been these thermal images that we've seen taken from pit stops in Japan that showed McLaren had its drums running cooler than other teams, which has prompted all these crazy theories. I think the FIA's been shown these images. It's looked at the McLaren a couple of times, hasn't seen anything. And from what I understand, post-race in Miami, they did a proper detailed inspection of the rear brake systems. We've had no notification yet. I think officially there can't be because it doesn't come until the next race if this was part of a formal post-race physical inspection. But I think the very fact that it wasn't notified by the FIA on the night to show a problem, and the fact the team, as far as I understand, wasn't told there was any issue with it, means it should be all clear. So either on Wednesday we'll get a note saying that the McLaren was inspected on the brakes and it was fine, or we won't hear anything, in which case it was all fine because it wasn't an official inspection, if any of that makes sense.
Yeah, this is the thing. There's nothing wrong with getting the effect that McLaren are getting. That's what everybody's working towards, and small differences, small amounts of reduction in the amount of energy going into the tyres, the better ability for it to kind of bleed that temperature that it builds off through that general the sort of parts in the corner is all beneficial. But I guess, Ben, the really worrying thing for the opposition is that we haven't had that much really hot running in F1 yet this season. Obviously, Miami was one, and we had sessions like FP3 in Bahrain where Piastri, if you remember, was stunningly fast. And the hotter it gets, the faster the McLaren gets. And we're about to go into a series of races with Canada in the middle, albeit in the European summer, where it's going to be pretty warm. So you'd be quite worried, wouldn't you, about particularly the race pace advantage that McLaren's going to have?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is key to McLaren's advantage. Obviously, it's not only, I think, a function of the ambient or track temperatures, it's just conditions where the tyres overheat for whatever reason. We saw it in Melbourne, even though the track was cool, because they were running worn intermediates on a drying track. The advantage just ballooned. They were like 1 second a lap quicker than Verstappen at that later point of the stint. Similar in Bahrain, where it's not so much the temperature because it's at night, but the track roughness. Tyre temperature is always hard to keep in check. The benefits there too. Obviously, Miami, you'd expect that to continue as we go through the summer and all the races are towards the hotter end. But it's also not a new thing, I think, that this McLaren being stronger at the end of stints when the tyres are worn and the temperature is hard to manage was there last year. We saw 2 examples quite early in the season, Imola and Spain come to mind, where you had a flat out race basically between Verstappen and Norris in the upgraded McLaren, and Norris was stronger at the end of those stints. So it feels like something that McLaren, having been in the opposite position in 2023 when Verstappen was pulverising people by 30 or 40 seconds, they've worked on this rear tyre management thing through, as John said, clever engineering, and they're just building on it. And as obviously everything else is condensed and the field's got closer and aerodynamic development has become harder to find, these kind of smaller but very consequential details make a bigger difference.
And it's something that McLaren works on a lot over the winter. Andrea Stella said on Sunday night in Miami, we targeted this specifically over the winter. They changed approach, slightly tweaked the concept. There's not a radical difference from last year, but it's elements of steps to improve this through good engineering, through good decisions. And I think it's just a consequence of that. And now it's up to the others to work out what's being done and if they can do it themselves.
It also won't just be one thing, will it? Obviously, we're focusing very much on the brake drum arrangement, probably the physical way it dissipates heat. But there's compound benefits in terms of how the overall car is run. I mean, John, you did an article about the cooling and how McLaren doesn't have to open up the car as much as others to keep the cooling system under control. That obviously confers an aerodynamic benefit. And if you're able to run more downforce because you're not giving it away to cooling, that also helps you look after the tyres, particularly on a race stint, because you're able to just run, more competitively at, higher ride heights, for example. McLaren's done a lot in terms of suspension adjustment and managing that aerodynamic platform. So if their car's more stable in terms of the ride height during a race distance, that will also help in terms of how the drivers can manage the tyres. Plus, you've got the element of the drivers, how they use the tyres in the car during the races. So you although the brake thing might be very clever and important, it's not working in isolation. It's part of a whole joined up, cohesive engineering approach.
I think what's quite interesting is obviously teams will always say there's no magic bullet in Formula One, but I almost feel like some rival teams, and I don't think anybody will be surprised that it's the blue one in particular, almost are acting as if there is a magic bullet that they're missing. Yeah. And I'm not sure the Red Bull's particularly strong on this score as well. So I think that magnifies the problem. But John, it's clear there is some needle behind the scenes, isn't there? Obviously, that tyre water joke that Zach Brown had with the water bottle was very much pointed at the suggestions last year about having water in the tyres. And it's quite interesting that McLaren's willing to kind of make fun of what Red Bull were doing in this case, and also try and use it to make a broader, serious point about the sort of insinuations that may or may not be going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, it's been a long-running theme between those two teams. We can go back to started off on flexi wings, the annoyance from Red Bull about McLaren having been very aggressive on the flexi wings since Miami last year, and flexi wings have become a must-have thing to do with these regulations because of the ground effect concept. Means you suffer from low speed understeer, you suffer from high speed oversteer, and the best way to address those two problems is a flexi wing. Flexi front wing. So there was pushing on that. Red Bull didn't win that battle initially, but it's coming for Spain. Then we had mini DRS, which was Red Bull against McLaren, and the Ferrari joined in as well. And then McLaren hit back with the Red Bull's front bib adjuster. Then we had water in the tyres in Brazil. Then we've had mini DRS again in Bahrain testing this year, aimed at McLaren. Then we've had what's going on with the rear tyres and brake systems now. And I think, we may get a truce for Imola and Monaco potentially, especially if the FIA gives the McLaren brakes the official all clear. But then I think it'll all kick off again in Spain when we get this TD on the front wings. If there's any hint of a change in competitive form, be it in the race, be it in qualifying, then initially the fingers will start pointing again and suspicions will be out there. And we will be back to the tit for tat, whichever direction it goes in.
It's the one thing that's inevitable. The competitive paranoia as well that Mark Hughes sometimes refers to. But it's an interesting thing, isn't it, Ben? Because I do wonder if perhaps the Red Bull outlook is a little bit questionable in that it seems to be looking for external problems. Now, one thing I will say is that with that bib adjuster, the floor adjustment thing that there are accusations of last year, we should say that we're not taking that as something like that, because there's not specific evidence that was used. So this is kind of what happens. You get the accusations going back and forth, and until something's proved, ideally via a protest, because that's actually the correct ideal forum to do it, because then it all ends up being out there in public. But it does seem like maybe Red Bull's looking at a lot of external factors, and maybe the expectation that the TD kicking in for Spain will change everything as well could be another part of that.
Yeah, that seems to be what they're pinning their hopes on. It feels like Red Bull's reaching a bit, and it's all part of this kind of prevailing sense that they're crumbling a bit. You know, the team is going through a massive transition. Newey's not there anymore. Other senior people have left. They've dropped away competitively. The thing we haven't discussed is this feeling that still prevails on the internet and seemingly also in George Russell's mind, that Red Bull lost something at the same time as McLaren gained in Miami last year. This idea of brake steer, which has never been really conclusively proven one way or the other. But there still seems to be this idea that Red Bull lost out somewhere with the FIA, and then perhaps they're feeling aggrieved that similar stuff's not happening in reverse, because they keep pushing this idea that McLaren's doing this thing or that thing or the other thing. It should be said also that's, you know, part of the normal skullduggery of F1, and it's fine to throw rocks at rival teams to try to destabilise them, so long as you've got your own house in order. And that's the bit I'm just not sure about with Red Bull. They just don't seem to really have a proper grasp anymore of what they're doing. They've got stuck in a development rut. And then as the pressure builds, particularly when Verstappen becomes unhappy, because it seems like their whole competitive picture depends on keeping him happy and aligned, they start to lose their minds a bit more. And this paranoia you mentioned, Ed, creeps in. That water in the tyres thing very much smacked of peak Red Bull paranoia. And I feel like a big part of that dissipating was not so much the FIA looking into things, which, to be fair, they have done, even if it's been in the background. It was Verstappen winning that race in the wet, having one of his, best ever victories. That just seemed to calm everything down. When Red Bull are winning and Verstappen's doing well, they're quite calm. But as soon as they get pulverised by McLaren on an individual weekend, they sort of seem to lose the plot. And it is worrying that they appear to be more focused on McLaren than they are on themselves.
It's worth noting as well that it is the job of race teams to push the boundaries. So they'll both be doing that. I always say that it's not about whether a car's legal or illegal. It has to be not illegal, which is a very subtle conceptual difference for me, in that you push the limits and you need to be, compliant with the letter of the law and be justifiable in what you're doing. But it doesn't necessarily to be in with what the spirit of the regs intended or whatever. It's what's there.
McLaren are just better at doing that now, it seems.
Seem to be.
With all these things that we've discussed, whether it's mini DRS or something to do with the brakes, they just seem to have become the team that's closer to dancing on that line. It always used to be Red Bull. So there may be just that element of almost competitive jealousy, that what was once a strength of that team has now become not necessarily a weakness, but not something that they're at the forefront of.
It's almost as if one of the brilliant technical geniuses who loves operating in grey areas of the regulations moved from Red Bull to McLaren.
Yeah, who knows? Perhaps it's just McLaren marshalling their troops better, to do a subtle pun. But yeah, Rob Marshall obviously moved there. Very, very clever guy, and key part of Red Bull's success, and they're contributing massively to McLaren. And yeah, it's all about that, pushing into the grey areas. That's not bad or wrong. That's the name of the game. So McLaren right now are doing it better.
You know what's just as important as the car you drive? What you wear on your feet while driving it. Our friends at Pilotti totally get that. They've been designing driving-inspired shoes for real enthusiasts for over 2 decades, and right now they've dropped a proper deal. The Cruise, one of their most versatile low-profile driving shoes, is on sale for just $99. And if you click the link in the description, then enter the code TheRaceA2025 at checkout, you get another 15% off, making it even more of a bargain. The Cruise is lightweight, easy to wear, and built with subtle performance details that come in handy whether you're behind the wheel or out for a coffee stop mid-road trip. Super comfortable but with racing DNA baked in, and even worn by F1 drivers. From the paddock to the street, these shoes aren't just inspired by racing, they're built for it. And don't forget, each shoe has Pilotti's patented roll control heel, designed for smooth pedal transitions and all-day comfort, and Pilotti even ship worldwide now. So if you want to look sharp and drive even sharper, check them out at Pilotti.com, and especially the Cruise, now just $99, but only for a limited time, so grab your pair while you can, and don't forget to use code TheRaceA2025 for that extra 15% off.
Right, let's move on to our next topic now, John, because Carlos Sainz Sr., not Junior, has emerged as a potential candidate to challenge for the FIA presidency. There's obviously an election later this year. Mohammed Ben Sulayem is expected to stand. He hasn't officially said he will, but he's going to. I think we all expect that. Do you think Carlos Sainz is a realistic candidate?
I'm not totally sure on this one, because I think there's a lot of stuff taking place behind the scenes that hasn't hit the public domain yet. And I think Carlos has decided to go public that he's considering it. And some people I've spoken to have kind of questioned why you want to go public to say you're considering doing something. Surely you should wait until you actually got everything lined up and then you say, I'm doing it. And I think one of the issues at the moment is, from what I understand, there are other candidates kind of doing work behind the scenes, making sure everything's lined up and ready to go before they go public. And what has to happen for those who feel that Ben Sulayem needs a proper challenger is that only one candidate can do this. The requirements of the FIA election, the fact you've got to get this team of 10 people, vice presidents and all from specific regions, they can only appear on one of this list you've got to provide. It means it's almost impossible for two candidates to go up because you split the opposition vote. So if there is a concerted, focused campaign to put a proper candidate up against Ben Sulayem, it needs to be behind one person. And I think some people have been caught a little bit surprised that Carlos has kind of put himself forward at the moment. A lot of movements going on behind the scenes with other candidates. So I don't think I think there was perhaps an impression that, there was this effort going on behind the scenes and Carlos was the chosen person that would be pushed forward as the front person. But I don't think it's happened like that. I think he's kind of come forward and confirmed that he's considering it. And now is kind of putting his team together and trying to evaluate what to do. Whereas other people are getting on with the what to do, and then we'll decide if it's good enough to go public or keep it quiet and, wait for another day.
I think it's very important to separate two factors, because people will be listening thinking, well, Carlos Sainz would be a great FIA president, wouldn't he? He's an intelligent guy, knows motorsport inside out. He's been involved in road safety initiatives, so he's got a bit of an interest on the mobility side. He understands how politics work. He's got a very broad interest in the world. So as a character, as a person with a set of skills in terms of the kind of the big picture of that role, Carlos Sainz probably sounds quite good. But it's very much that detail, because it's a political thing, isn't it? It is about playing the politics of the FIA correctly to galvanise that support. And you don't just sort of stick your hand up and that happens. It's got to be done at great amount of effort, great amount of expense behind the scenes to try and get all those ducks in a row. So that seems to me to be the thing that's a big question. I mean, he may have been doing it in the background, but it's difficult to do, particularly from sort of outside the FIA.
Yeah, it sounds from what John is describing a bit like US presidential races, where you need the parties to unify under one candidate, and you have this round of kind of politicking beforehand where they all either throw their hats into the ring formally or informally. They try to kind of test the waters of support. And it could be that Sainz is kind of unilaterally doing that, but whatever happens, he'll need to kind of join up with whoever everyone decides is the unity candidate to stand behind Ben Sulayem, because there's not going to be anyone else coming from inside the FIA. It's going to be, even though it's not confirmed, him versus someone else. And as John was explaining, it has to be someone else. It's not going to be multiple people. It's not going to be kind of like a UK election where you've got 4 or 5 parties to choose from and maybe 1 or 2 lunatics who are running on the fringe. So either Sainz is going to have to convince the other people who've been working more quietly behind the scenes on the doing to unify around him, or they decide he needs to be the face of this change. He's the best person with the widest reach and best character or whatever to pull our agenda forward, or he's going to have to fall in line behind someone else who's better and support them. And that's going to be the most important thing for any opposition to Ben Sulayem. If they want to have a realistic chance of standing and winning, they're going to have to be properly aligned and have no division, I think.
I think it'd be interesting to see whether Sainz actually presses on with it, because he's still talking about considering it. And, you know, he won't do it on a wing and a prayer. So if he presses the button and goes for it, it means that things have come together behind the scenes. So maybe getting it out there in public has made a difference. There is one interesting question, isn't there, John? If Carlos Sainz, let's say he were to become FIA president, which seems fairly unlikely at this stage, but there obviously is the question of the conflict of interest potential with his son racing in Formula One. It's quite an interesting little hypothetical in many ways, isn't it? Do you see there'd be a problem with that?
Yeah, I spoke to someone quite senior level within the FIA yesterday just about this issue, which from Carlos Sainz's perspective, you know, he talked about this. He said, I'll step back from any involvement with Carlos Jr. and it won't be a problem. He can stand on his own 2 feet. But I think from a FIA perspective, I think some people could be concerned by this and the potential links, because it would, you know, cloud every decision that was made. And if anything was done in a way that favoured any element that his son was involved in, it would be instantly, this is a conflict of interest. We see it in everything that Mohammed Ben Sulayem does. If there's any link to decisions he's made, people are tracing it back to other elements. So I think it's a bigger issue within the FIA than it may be us looking from the outside, because, you know, we know Carlos Sainz Sr. is, you know, he's an intelligent person. He knows where the boundaries should be. He probably wouldn't act in a way that favoured his son over doing what was right, for example. But it's not about what we think. It's about what FIA member clubs think and what they believe. And that's the crucial thing. And I think it's very difficult. But what is interesting, though, also is that Mohammed Ben Sulayem has obviously put Malcolm Wilson forward as his deputy president for sport, who's heavily involved in the Ford Rally program. So I think there is an issue there about, you know, are there already conflicts of interest within the FIA over potential people with a competitive stake in the business being involved in FIA decisions? So it's an interesting element. And I think it's something that can't be downplayed enough. I think it is something that would factor into any decision going forward.
And I think the important thing is, sorry, just quickly, the important thing is that conflict of interest doesn't necessarily mean that individual is actively pursuing their competing interest. It just means it's there. So you can be completely above board and doing the right thing, but there's still a conflict of interest. And that perception is really, really important. So even if, let's say Carlos Sainz were president and he were completely recused from anything that might influence something going on with his son, then that conflict of interest still exists. And that's the case with anyone. It is difficult, isn't it, when it comes to motorsport, because motorsport is competitive. And if you're going to have motorsport related people getting involved in senior FIA positions, often they will have active connections with things that are going on. So it's a complicated question.
Yeah, the optics of it are almost the most important thing, and maybe the thing that completely kills a Carlos Sainz Sr. bid stone dead, unless somehow Carlos Jr. decides to step down from his F1 career to allow his dad to pursue his political career. Because people will always look at it, especially now that Ben Sulayem has become more actively involved directly in Formula One affairs. There's this idea that the president's kind of tinkering with how Formula One works all the time, which wasn't quite so apparent in the Jean Todt era. So if Sainz Sr. is in theory president and his son's racing for Williams or whoever, there's always going to be that connection, even if, as you say, Ed, he recuses himself as much as possible, takes away, in theory, all the direct connections. It's just an undeniable familial link that can't be got around. I remember when we all of us used to work for the Motorsport Network and Zach Brown had a role within it. He was forever obsessed with how that was perceived by the F1 media and the public. And there were always accusations there of conflict of interest because he had a role with McLaren. And in the end, part of the reason he stepped away from Motorsport Network was because of this. You can't escape it, even if he was whiter than white, as it's said, behaved completely above board, which I'm sure he did. there's always this perception that because you're linked to organisations, you're therefore getting favourable treatment for your team because you have these two roles, and he decided he had to give up the lesser of those roles to focus on McLaren. Inescapable reality, basically, even if you're behaving completely above board.
And it's a level of trust as well from stakeholders that the team, if Williams surge to the front and are fighting for a world championship in 2-3 years, and if we come to crunch decisions the FI have to make about regulation changes that favour one side or the other, or financial regulations that do something, everyone will perceive whatever decision he makes as being influenced by where his son fits into all this. So it's something that can't be discounted and would forever kind of cloud everything. Especially if a team felt, they wanted to go to the FI president and complain about something Williams were doing, would they feel comfortable doing that? Would they feel that they wouldn't get anywhere because of those family ties? It's an element I think needs to be heavily considered.
People weaponize it too. As Ed was saying before about, F1 teams trying to pull every lever they can to gain their own advantage. This is one you would endlessly pull against Williams and Sainz if they were, as you say, competing for a championship. They just wouldn't be able to get away from it.
It's interesting, actually, you cited that Zach Brown example, because that reminded me of when that first happened. I think at the time I was probably editor-in-chief of Autosport, and I did grab Zach in Abu Dhabi to speak to him about it, and he said, well, there's no conflict of interest. And I said, well, I just remember saying to him, well, there is. And that to me really highlighted the element of how you conduct yourself versus the perception, because even if you conduct yourself honourably, and actually in all my dealings with Zach in that capacity, there was never any problem with that. I think he did act honourably, but again, perception is the big problem. And you can think of it with, let's say there's some kind of rule change in F1 that benefits the team that Sainz is working for in an obvious way, and then suddenly you get, oh, why's that happened? And it could also have the kind of effect of, if there's something that could be seen to benefit something that would be the right thing to do, there might be a pullback from it for fear of that perception. So it's really,
you
really
psych yourself out, basically. You don't make the right decision because of these considerations that shouldn't be a consideration. It just becomes a massive mess that's very hard to escape.
Well, imagine if Sainz was driving for McLaren now and the FIA, with Sainz seen as president, and the FIA's cleared their McLaren brakes, then instantly other teams will be going, teams are going, this is ridiculous, that this is why it's happened, even though there'd be absolutely nothing in it. Would be no element of favoritism or Sainz thinking about anything different, but it's the perception from outside that it is a bigger problem, even if the actual problem doesn't exist.
And actually, we should also, just coming back to the practicalities of it, obviously motorsport it's about a third of what the FIA does. The majority of it is mobility stuff. So how is he seen in the mobility world? Hard to say. I think Sainz is a very credible person generally. As I said before, he has a lot of qualities and skills, but just the practicality of whether he could galvanise enough support, even if he was kind of doing all the right things, is a big question. And this is what we have to remember. It's a big political battle, really. It's not really about motorsport. It's about the politics of the FIA. So it's interesting. And I suppose the positive is that it does mean there's a big name out there who's provoking some debate, and you never know, it might interest some people to have somebody like that turning up, and who knows what that can mean. But certainly with the FIA elections, the incumbent, if you're standing to hold on to the presidency, you're in a very, very, very strong position just through the way things work, and that's long since been the case. Right, we're going to finish off by tackling a batch of questions from the Race Members Club. As always, thanks to everyone for sending in your questions. Sorry we can never get to all of them. If we did that, we'd be doing 3-hour podcasts every day, which I'm sure listeners would run out of patience for. And remember, we've still got that special 75% off your first month special offer that's running to mark 75 years of the Formula One World Championship. Of F1, I know is the wording we use, but I'm always a little bit, I get a bit pedantic about that phrasing, given the F1 rules existed before 1950. But yeah, 75 years of the World Championship. And if you click the link in the episode description, you'll be able to find out more about that. And you get loads of stuff as a member, question asking privileges, ad-free listening and viewing of videos, loads and loads of bonus exclusive content, F1 Extra podcasts, and our chats on race weekends. But the first question for you, Ben, comes from Ansi Rulamo. How do you evaluate Yuki Tsunoda's progress at Red Bull? Do you think his performances so far vindicate the decision to drop Sergio Perez?
I've been wondering about this myself, and at the moment, I would say no. He doesn't look like an upgrade. At his best, he's occupying the area that Perez was often occupying at his best towards the end of last season, which is this kind of 8th, 9th, 10th, just about in Q3, scraping a few points position. Obviously, you expect that Tsunoda has a higher ceiling for growth because he's been in Formula One for a lot less time than Perez had been. But I'm already seeing this kind of worrying trend in the early races where he seems to be saying the right thing, feels quite comfortable with the car at a certain baseline through the practice sessions and even in the early stages of qualifying. And then when it comes to the kind of final, right, you've got to go for the more uncomfortable setup, front wing flap adjustment, lay it all on the line, Q3, balls out lap. He falls apart. He doesn't make the progression, doesn't have the same feeling in the car. So you start to think, well, actually the best outcome of this change, via obviously the weird Liam Lawson anomaly at the start of the season, is that it's showing Red Bull, if they're listening and watching properly, some of what Perez had been saying last season, that the car is just very, very difficult to drive on the limit for someone who isn't Max Verstappen.
Yeah, it's interesting to see his progress curve over the coming races. I think the main thing is getting rid of Sergio Perez was perfectly justified because it was absolutely certain that he was not getting anything close to the potential of the car extracted from it. But then again, neither of his successors. So, yeah, I'd like to see Tsunoda continue. But it's a little bit of a worry because we've seen this with a lot of the drivers. They kind of have an upward curve, then they almost bounce off a ceiling, and then they slump back. So, yeah, still a little bit more to play out on that. But, yeah, Tsunoda needs a step, I would definitely say. Next question, John, comes from Lachlan Babbage. Can Aston Martin salvage anything from this year? What hope do they have of keeping Alonso as a driver for next year?
Yeah, Aston's in a really tricky spot at the moment. It's kind of hemmed in both by the future and its past. It obviously wants to not sacrifice anything for 2026, which is impacting upgrades and potential. If this was a normal season, then it would be throwing resource and trying to work on improvements and pushing forwards. But it doesn't want to pull any resource from 26, which is limiting what it can do in 25. But also the past is hurting it because it's got this history of never being very good with upgrades. Started seasons strongly, look at 23, amazing, but didn't build on it, kind of fell away. Same story last year. And new team boss Andy Cowell is very mindful that there's no point pushing on with upgrades for upgrades' sake until they understand properly what's gone wrong in the past and get all their tools lined up. So his mindset is basically we need to get all the answers in place first before we commit to upgrades. And that's more important for the future in 26 because they've been so terrible at it in the past. So that they're kind of trapped between these two worlds of not wanting upgrades to ruin the future and not wanting upgrades because they've not worked in the past, which leaves them in this no man's land until they get, wind tunnel track, CFD all lined up. So I don't think there's going to be any immediate switch. We may get a few little minor tweaks here and there for Imola. Spain, everyone's got to do a new front wing anyway, which will impact the car. But I don't see a dramatic transformation in Aston this year. I think they're just going to have to kind of battle on and grab some points in the chaos races, in effect. And in terms of Fernando, he'll hang on till 26. It's one final chance he has to win more races and potentially a championship if Newey can deliver some magic. Whether that can happen or not, I think it's probably unrealistic to expect a team with a 8th, 9th, 10th quickest car to be winning a championship in the following season. But it's the hope that Fernando has, and it's why he won't walk away. Because I think, it would be typical of Fernando, who's got a history of moving to the wrong teams and making wrong decisions just at the wrong time to decide, I'm not going to do this, it's not going to happen. And then Newey comes up with a blinder.
Alonso's throwing all of his eggs into the 2026 Newey basket, isn't he? It feels like the whole team is, to me. Like they're dancing this line of like trying to say that they haven't thrown 2025 away, but I feel like they've gone into 2025 going, this season doesn't matter. It's all about setting everything up for 26 as best we can. Newey, the tools, the new facility, any data they get from the current car is really just about what can we feed in to calibrate that tool ready for the 2026 development. So it is quite literally a nothing season for Alonso and Stroll, but they're sort of not allowed to say that. So we kind of end up in this situation where it's like, they are doing nothing on that car, apart from obviously the Barcelona wing, because everyone has to do that. Unless, of course, their wing is so unflexible that they don't have to change it. I think there's one team, we know Sauber, is it Ed, who've basically said their wing isn't going to change because they're so far behind on the flexi wings. There's no point. Unless Aston are in that position, then really this car I don't think will change at all, because they're not wasting any time or resource on this car. They're all focused on, can we make a big leap forward in 2026? Whether it's enough for the championship, who knows? But it's definitely their best shot, because as John explained, they've been lost for ages, basically, in terms of car development.
Well, Andy Cowell, the team principal, pretty much admitted that, didn't he, in Miami? I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said words to the effect of, gathering data is more important than points this year. And that very much is at the heart of what you talked about there, Ben, in terms of needing to just sharpen their tools, etc. And that doesn't mean they're not trying, but this car was always going to be a test laboratory for next year. But I think that's the key. They could get to the end of the year and have scored a few more points and actually learned less than if they score fewer points, but they are actually getting the wins in terms of the knowledge and the data and how they work on things. And it's that whole loop, isn't it, of wind tunnel, CFD, in the real world. Cal keeps talking about the sort of the three worlds that you've got to get lined up, and that sort of virtuous circle of development loop bouncing between the three of them. That's where they really need to make gains. And obviously with the new wind tunnel they've got, the whole new factory and everything, that's the absolute key. But,
and they've overhauled the track team this year, haven't they? There's been a lot of senior management change. There's been a lot of change in terms of the facilities. But the last thing this year has been the on-track team has also been reshuffled. So it all feels like a big kind of throw everything up in the air and try and get it to all settle down in a new place.
But the one thing they can't do is sort of give up on this year and just coast with it.
No.
It's just a question of where the effort is going into. And yeah, you just have to take it as... take it on trust that they are doing the right things and learning, and that will impact the 26 car. But at the same time, 26 car work has been going on for some time. So the same science limitations, if you want to call it that, will have gone into some of that. So it's possible they're already falling behind in the back. We just don't know. And we won't get a good picture of that until the cars run next year. Well, the next question comes from Eric Owen that I'll take. Do you see Williams getting a podium before the end of the year? And Hector Palacios Ochoa says, asks if we think Williams is on a par with Ferrari and close to Mercedes on race pace. Well, do I see them getting a podium before the end of the year? Not on merit, by which I mean, yeah, there could be a race where some of the quicker cars, a couple of McLarens drive into each other and retire, and a Mercedes drops out, and then maybe, you could have an Albon or Sainz on the podium. But on pure merit, I don't think they could race their way to a podium. They might be able to nick one in a sprint race, perhaps, if you get yourself into that track position in what's effectively a one-stint race, you might be able to stay there. But on pure pace, I don't think so, especially given, obviously, their full focus very much is on 2026 development, and it's just making the best out of the package they've got. And Miami also, I think, flattered the Williams insofar as, simple circuit, some decent straights and some relatively simple corners without those combination entries, played to the strengths of the car, or rather mitigated the weaknesses. So that's what allowed them to beat Ferrari and race and
Ferrari being rubbish.
Exactly, yeah. So I think Miami was the sort of top echelon of where Williams will be competitively. They're strong, but I still see them more as midfield leader than interloper with Mercedes and Ferrari. And I don't think we'll see a big performance step this year from them that will take them to getting podiums. Also in the world of Williams, Ben, a question from Jordan Kennedy. This start to the season has obviously been remarkable for Alex Albon's credentials. What has it done, if anything, to Sainz's reputation?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think Sainz has helped wake Albon up a bit. I'm not saying that Albon was totally sleeping, but we're seeing the best version of Alex Albon again. And I think he just got a little bit too comfortable with having effectively a rubbish teammate in the other car. And he definitely hasn't got that now with Sainz. So he's having to deliver week in, week out. That's good to see. Sainz, I think, is benefiting from what you just outlined before, Ed, about Williams taking a step and leading the midfield. So just from an optics point of view, once you've dropped out of the big four teams, you can't really do any better than be in the kind of 9th or 10th position all the time. And that's where Sainz is. So he kind of protects his reputation, even though he's taken a step down the grid and not just gone into anonymity. And I think the other element that's not in the question that's really important is how much Ferrari is struggling now that he's not there, and how much Lewis Hamilton is struggling having gone there, because that kind of doesn't vindicate Ferrari's decision to replace Sainz. If anything, it looks worse on them that Sainz has gone and they've taken a plunge. So I think he benefits from kind of all those things together, basically, in protecting his reputation, which is well deserved. You know, he may still lack that final edge of pace compared to the absolute top drivers on the current grid, you know, the 3 or 4 absolute best. But I think in terms of adaptability, he's again showing that he's as good as anyone. And that's probably a function of the fact he's changed teams so many times, as much as it's a reflection of how good he is fundamentally as a driver technically.
I think it's also important to note that it was only really the first 3 weekends. I mean, the first 2 weekends, he was a clear step off Albon. Third weekend, he was getting fairly close. And then from Bahrain onwards, his pace has been really, really strong. But the races in Bahrain and Jeddah got away from him a bit. Obviously, had that big mistake in the sprint race. So I don't think Sainz is doing too badly at all. It's just only really in Saudi that he's had a complete weekend and he's put everything together. But Miami, he felt his qualifying was the best it's been. And he was unlucky at the start of the race as well when he had to check up because of Norris rejoining, and that allowed Albon to swoop around him. And then they had the light contact, the right rear wheel of Albon's car and the front left of Sainz that gave Sainz a little bit of damage as well. So I actually don't see Sainz as having a particularly doing a bad job or anything. I don't think it's really denting his reputation, and the trend is that it's going to be kind of nip and tuck between Albon and Sainz, I suspect, for the rest of the season. Right, next question comes from Stephen Moore for you, John. Is it time for Mercedes to show George Russell the same love it showed Lewis and is showing Kimi? He's risen to the challenge of team leader and has been seriously quick since the start of the season. It seems like Toto Wolff and co couldn't be bothered to heap praise.
I think he's getting the praise. I don't think, you know, the messaging from Toto and everything is kind of downplaying George's performances. There was that famous quote from, I think, Chinese Grand Prix where he said George is, you know, top 3 driver this season, potentially top 2, and maybe even on the way to being top 1. So I think the praise is there. What isn't there is the contract, which is a far more interesting issue. Because obviously George wants to stay at Mercedes next year, probably will stay at Mercedes next year, but there doesn't seem to have been a rush from Mercedes to lock him down, nor George to kind of force the hand and get the contract done. So how much of that,
though, can he? He's got no power in the driver market, so he's just waiting for Toto to go, here you go.
So just how much of that is Toto, you know, waiting to see how things pan out with Max? How much is just because they've agreed to wait until post Monaco or the summer break to get it sorted as normal, and it's us getting more excited about it? You know, we don't know, but yeah, I think the praise is there in public. It's just he hasn't yet got his signature on a nice firm contract for the future.
There's an element probably of trying to keep him on his toes as well, because there's always this thing, you know, his predecessor Valtteri Bottas used to bemoan the fact he was on this 1-year cycle of deals and how hard that made his life as the season went on and no news was coming. But sometimes you see it so often, you get more out of a driver by keeping them on the edge and not having them too comfortable. And I'm not saying that's definitely what's happening here, but it's quite interesting that Russell has started the season so strongly, you know, as Toto alluded to, maybe top 1 or 2 in terms of early season performance, and his contract is up and he desperately needs to renew with that team. So Toto will be probably mindful of not potentially destabilising that performance or allowing Russell to relax too much by doing the deal too early. Also because, as you mentioned, Max Verstappen's lurking in the background. His Red Bull future's perennially up for discussion, and it would be remiss of Toto to commit to Russell and then suddenly we get to the summer break and Verstappen goes, do you know what? I've had enough of this. I can exit. I'm not in the top 2 in the championship. And then you miss out on the opportunity to sign the guy who is the number 1 driver on the grid on pure ability, I would say.
I think it's worth noting as well that there has been quite a bit of positivity from Wolff. I remember him after Bahrain where Russell weathered all those problems late on. He talked about how that was an unbelievable drive and the quality of it. So I think it's there. But I guess there is a bit of a different dynamic, isn't there, John? Because obviously Russell's long been a Mercedes driver, but Antonelli has been a Mercedes driver since he was a kid in karting. So there is kind of an even longer standing relationship. So I think probably some of this question reflects the inevitable positivity there is surrounding what Kimi Antonelli's doing.
Yeah, I mean, Kimi is, you know, Kimi's well loved to that team. He's come in. I think he's been very strong, you know, great, especially in qualifying, good result in sprints, still needs to make improvements in races, still needs to get improvements in kind of tyre management and execution of races. But, he's an 18-year-old who's in his first season in Formula One fighting at the front of a very, very competitive F1 grid. I don't think we can expect too much too soon from him. And all the spotlight inevitably is on when a youngster comes in and makes an impression, like sprint pole in Miami. Kimi getting that is a far bigger story than if Russell had got it, just because Russell's been there. We've seen it. He's done it in the past. So this is just an inevitability of the situation of what's happening. But I don't think Russell feels unloved, but I do think he would feel a bit more loved if he had that contract done.
Yeah, I think they can say what they want if he had the new contract locked up in a bank vault somewhere. So yeah, interesting to see how that will emerge, how that will evolve, rather, with the Max Verstappen interest, etc., as we talked about not so long ago on this podcast. Right, the final question I'll take from Paul Matsuda: what mechanisms are there, if any, for drivers to know that they're driving at 40% of race pace during a VSC? Has any driver ever been penalised for breaching the 40% rule, and if so, what was the penalty? Well, the pace that they set under the VSC, it's actually about 30% off a quick lap. You see lots of figures and numbers bandied around, but they basically they come up, the ECU will calculate the same number for everyone at a sort of certain lap time that is safe under the VSC. And then what will happen is you get a delta up on your dash that will tell you whether you're ahead or behind, and you've just got to make sure that you're behind the delta at least once in every of the marshalling mini sectors. And if you're not, you're deemed to be speeding, and you also have to respect the total lap time at the two safety car lines. That's the way the VSC works. So the drivers will have that live thing on their dash that they can drive to. And yeah, drivers do get penalised. Albon got penalised for it in Miami, actually. It was a 5-second penalty, which is the standard one. But there have been other ones. Max Verstappen got one in the sprint into Lagos last year that cost him third place as well. So the drivers have to be really, really vigilant. And it's always difficult because not only you're not just trying to respect that delta, you're also trying to make sure you're in the right place as well, because if you, obviously it's a slightly inexact science, so you want to make sure that you're sort of as quick as possible and as close to the car ahead as possible for the restart in particular. So it's quite an interesting little challenge. But the penalty, it should be noted, can be bigger because it's any of the available penalties, which is 5-second, 10-second drive-through penalty and a 10-second stop-go. They're all available for a safety car speeding breach, but the standard penalty, as was actually mentioned in the Albon decision, was 5 seconds. And yeah, the VSC system works pretty well. Well, thanks to everybody for those questions. Thanks to John and Ben for your insight. The F1 season's getting going again with a triple header coming up, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.